Peter Jennings is the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning.
Explain to people watching this, what is the state of play on the ground in Iraq? Is Islamic State in retreat? Are they in advance? What?
Well, we've had some territory swap hands over the last 6 months or so. But broadly speaking, what I'd say is since the fall of the town of Ramadi in Anbar province, we're seeing Islamic State, which is essentially has the momentum on its side. It's really moved from being a terror organisation to a group that is capable of fighting as conventional armies do. And they seem to have no difficulties in continuing to recruit the numbers of fighters they need to undertake these actions. And they're very well equipped with material which they are either able to buy on the black market or simply take from Iraqi forces. So, for example, they've re-equipped themselves with large numbers of armoured vehicles since the takeover of Ramadi. So at this stage, I have to say, sadly, I think the momentum on the ground is still with the Islamic State.
So at the very least, any effort at the moment, if it's the same type of strategy and the same sort of forces involved, don't look making any headway, at least in the short term?
I think that's right, and it was notable that we had the senior leadership of Defence at parliamentary committee hearings this week saying it's going to be a 5-year campaign. You know, to which my response is, well, we defeated Nazi Germany in 6 years. I mean, surely we can do better than that against what is said to be 30,000 people. But, you know, they are a tenacious enemy, and at the moment there is really no coherent strategy on the part of either the Iraqi ground forces and their Iranian backers or the international coalition, which has trainers and aircraft. At the moment, whatever passes for a strategy amongst those groups is not succeeding in pinning ISIL down or defeating it.
What does it say about the effectiveness then of US air power, assisted by the Australians, you know, bombing these groups, but it doesn't seem to be making much difference?
Well, the air power effort is very constrained. If you look at the record of what's been done almost for a year now, it averages about 10 strikes a day. And you can contrast that to, you know, other campaigns where you might have hundreds of strikes in a day. And what's going on here is that very, very constraining rules of engagement have been written for the aircraft so that unless there is almost complete certainty, A, of hitting an ISIS target and B, of not inadvertently killing civilians, strikes won't take place. So the New York Times reported last week that only 1 in 4 strikes, or only 1 in 4 aircraft sorties actually releases bombs. And it's clear that they're not doing things like going after the leadership of ISIS, because we know that wherever those leaders are, they have groups of civilian, essentially hostages with them, precisely to prevent the Americans from taking them out in airstrikes. So what you're left with as a result of all of that is just picking away at the edges. If a vehicle's moving, that is perhaps something that can be taken out. If an aircraft sees a couple of fighters moving, they may be hit. But we're doing nothing to go after the leadership core or you know, any areas where it may be the case that civilians could also be injured.
If the current strategy is, as you say, incoherent, ineffective, what should be done? What would you like to see done?
Look, I think we have to sort of go back to basics here and say, well, none of us went there to lose. And therefore what we need to do is, you know, prosecute a strategy for victory or leave, I guess, is the alternative. Now, yeah, my strategy for victory would involve a number of elements. Firstly, I think we have to lift the level of aggression involved in airstrikes to actually go after the leadership group of ISIL. And one way that we could do that effectively is to have people on the ground who can act essentially as targeters for the airstrikes, so that they can make strikes more effective in combat operations. And then the second thing I'd do, Chris, is I'd say, well, we have trainers there who are advising and assisting their Iraqi military colleagues, but they're doing that behind the lines in sort of safe barrack areas, relatively safe barrack areas. And what we need to do is the same thing we did in Afghanistan, which is actually allow the trainers to go into the battlefield with their Iraqi soldiers. And what we found in Afghanistan is if you do that, the local troops will stick to the job. They are advised on the best tactics they can use, and they have the confidence to stay in the fight when they have their trainers with them.
That would risk Australian soldiers being involved in combat, and also the chance that they would die in combat. Do you think the government has a stomach for that?
Well, I'd say the reason the government hasn't done it is because no other international country is doing it. And they do understand that there is serious risk associated with that. I mean, this was an approach which saw 40 Australians killed in action in Afghanistan. But on the other hand, I think if you spoke to people in the Australian Defence Force, if they could speak to you, what they would actually be saying is, yes, we think this is the right strategy.
But given that the United States is now heading into a kind of the presidential election season, is there going to be the will on the behalf of the Americans to really step up in Iraq at the moment? It's politically difficult, isn't it, particularly for the Obama administration?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in Obama's case, I think still his number one strategic objective is to keep America as much out of this conflict as he can. And it's difficult for everybody else in the Washington scene. The Republicans, I think, would instinctively feel that it's perhaps better to have a more offensive military campaign, but it's bad politics in terms of American domestic responses. However, the problem that the Americans are in primarily, and then everyone else by default, is that the current sort of holding strategy is just not working. So I think that what that means is that ultimately more pressure will go on Obama to say there's just no point us continuing in the current sort of rather half-hearted way. And if we are to do anything which looks remotely like we're putting ISIL on the run, we need to sort of crank up the level of American support. When that happens, Chris, that might be the moment when the Australian government and other coalition parties would be prepared to do something more.
At the end of the day, will it be necessary to come to some sort of political solution here? Now, if we think back to Vietnam, in the early days of Vietnam, it seemed like they were the communists. It was an existential threat to the West. They were the proxies of China and Russia, and doing a deal with them was totally unimaginable. Right now, Islamic State is seen as the idea of doing any sort of negotiating with them is utterly unimaginable. But if this drags on for year after year after year, do we end up in that position?
I think we do. Again, if you look in Afghanistan, it took us about 10 or 15 years to conclude that maybe we should start to talk to the Taliban as being some way to come to a political solution. And I think history shows that wars generally end with a political outcome. But I would say no one is ready yet. And it has to be said, the Islamic State is not a group for negotiation, which does make them a little difficult because, they do have this very strong millenarian sort of end of days ideology, which doesn't make them easy people to do business with. My own sense is that I think the only way we're really going to make some progress for the bigger challenge, which is how do you fix Iraq, is we've got to cut out the cancer, right? The cancer is the Islamic State. Then once that's done, there is probably an even bigger challenge, which is how do we sew this country back together again when there is such distrust between the three main sort of ethnic and religious groupings. But there's almost no point even thinking about that until such time as we can deal with IS. And as I've looked at this over the course of the last year or so, what I've concluded is I think the only solution for the Islamic State is a military defeat. I think if we can destroy their leadership and put their troops on the run, that will take all the force out of their propaganda. And that's relevant to us back here in Australia because it's that propaganda, the sense of momentum and victory which they use in their propaganda, which I think is what is actually radicalising increasingly large numbers of young Australians to go over and fight.
Okay, Peter Jennings, thanks for explaining the situation to us.
Thank you.